No one expects salvation to arrive on two wheels, roaring like thunder. When a battered 12-year-old boy walked into a notorious Hells Angels clubhouse and asked for a job, he didn't just find a family, he ignited a war that would rip a corrupt town down to its very foundations. The blistering California sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Ridgeview, a dusty town that time and progress had largely forgotten. It was the summer of 2004, and the air was thick with the smell of dry sage, gasoline, and melting tar. On the far edge of town, separated from the respectable suburban neighborhoods by a rusted chain-link fence and a set of active railroad tracks, sat the Rusty Piston. To the locals it was a dive bar. To law enforcement it was a headache. But to the men inside it was a sanctuary. It was the local clubhouse for the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Inside the garage adjacent to the bar, the heavy, rhythmic thumping of classic rock fought against the roar of a dismantled Harley-Davidson engine. Big Rick Harrison, the president of the Ridgeview chapter, was wiping grease from his massive forearms with a shop rag. Rick was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4", his skin a canvas of faded ink and scars earned over decades of a hard-lived life. Standing next to him was Dutch Miller, the chapter's sergeant-at-arms, a lean, wiry veteran with cold eyes and a mind like a steel trap. They were busy arguing over the timing on a carburetor when the shadow fell across the garage floor. Rick looked up, expecting to see a prospect delivering parts, or maybe a local drunk who had wandered too far off the main road. Instead, standing in the doorway, was a boy. He couldn't have been older than 12. He was bone-thin, wearing a t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big and faded denim jeans, frayed at the hems. But it wasn't his ragged clothes that made the room fall completely silent. It was his face. The boy's left eye was swollen shut, surrounded by a blooming, angry purple contusion that spread down to his cheekbone. A fresh scab rested on his split lower lip, and he held his right arm slightly pressed against his ribs, breathing in shallow, careful gasps. The mechanics stopped their wrenches. The music seemed to fade into the background. A dozen hardened outlaws, men who had seen the darkest corners of the world, simply stared at the broken child standing in the mouth of their garage. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He looked directly at Big Rick, sensing instinctively who the alpha of the pack was. "Can I work here?" the boy asked. His voice was quiet, lacking the cracking squeak of puberty, but it held a strange, hollow gravel to it. Dutch chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Kid, you lost." The local arcade is about 3 miles back toward the civilized part of town. "I'm not lost," the boy replied, stepping further into the dim, oil-stained light of the garage. "I need money. I work hard. I can sweep. I can take out trash. I can clean tools. Can I work here?" Big Rick stepped forward, towering over the boy. He knelt down so they were eye level. Up close, Rick could see the faint, yellowing bruises fading on the boy's neck, the kind left by adult fingers. A cold fury flickered in the biker's chest, but his face remained impassive. "What's your name, kid?" Rick asked, his deep voice surprisingly gentle. "Jack," the boy answered, keeping his good eye locked on Rick's. "Well, Jack, looks to me like you need a doctor, not a job. You fall off a skateboard or something?" Jack looked away for a fraction of a second. The classic tell, "I fell down the stairs. I'm clumsy. Do you have a broom or not?" Rick exchanged a heavy loaded look with Dutch. Every man in that garage knew what a battered child looked like. The Hells Angels lived by their own set of laws, outside the bounds of conventional society, but they had a strict, unbreakable code. You don't hurt women, and you never hurt children. "All right, Jack," Rick said, standing up. He walked over to a corner and tossed a heavy push broom toward the kid. Jack caught it awkwardly, wincing as his rib shifted. "You see this lot? It's covered in broken glass, cigarette butts, and gravel. You sweep the whole thing into piles. It'll take you 3 hours in this heat. If you complain, you're fired. If you quit, you don't get a dime. You finish, I give you $20 and a hot meal." Jack didn't say a word. He just turned around, gripped the broom, and walked back out into the 100-degree heat. For the next 3 hours, the bikers watched him from the shade. Smitty Jenkins, a heavily bearded mechanic, shook his head. "Kid's gonna pass out, boss. Should I grab him a water?" "Let him work," Rick said, leaning against a toolbox, his eyes never leaving the skinny figure pushing the heavy broom. "He needs the dignity right now more than he needs the water." But when an hour passed, Rick quietly sent a prospect out to place an ice-cold bottle of water on an oil drum near where Jack was sweeping. Jack drank it in 3 massive gulps and went right back to work. He didn't stop. He didn't sit down. He just swept, his bruised face a mask of absolute desperate determination. When the sun finally began to dip below the horizon, painting the Ridgeview sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Jack walked back into the garage. He was drenched in sweat, covered in dust, and trembling slightly from exhaustion. He leaned the broom against the wall. "Lots clean," Jack said. Rick walked outside, inspecting the massive asphalt lot. It was spotless. Every piece of glass, every discarded cigarette swept into neat, manageable piles. Rick walked back inside, pulled a crisp $20 bill from his leather wallet, and handed it to the boy. "Good work," Rick said. "Smitty, get the kid a plate of whatever the old lady is cooking in the back." They sat Jack down at a heavy wooden table in the back of the bar, away from the patrons. They watched him inhale a plate of ribs, mashed potatoes, and cornbread like a starving stray dog. He didn't speak, just ate with a fierce intensity. When he was done, he stood up, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at Rick. "What time do you want me here tomorrow?" Rick couldn't help but smile. 3 o'clock. Don't be late. Weeks turned into a month, and Jack became a permanent fixture at the Hells Angels clubhouse. He arrived every day exactly at 3 p.m., straight from middle school. The tough, dangerous men who populated the Rusty Piston slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifted their behavior around the boy. Swear jars were suddenly implemented. Hideous, violent jokes were kept to whispers. Smitty started teaching Jack the difference between metric and standard wrenches. Dutch showed him how to safely polish the chrome on a $30,000 motorcycle without leaving streaks. Big Rick simply watched over him, a silent, imposing guardian. For the first time in his life, Jack began to smile. He learned to joke back. He started putting on the little weight. The bruises never fully stopped. They would heal, fading from purple to yellow, and then, after a weekend, Jack would show up with a split lip, or a slight limp, or fresh dark rings around his wrists. Every time Rick asked, Jack had a ready-made excuse. "I got into a fight at school. I tripped over a curb. I fell off my bike." The lies were transparent, but whenever pressed, Jack would completely shut down, a look of sheer, unadulterated terror flooding his eyes. He would threaten to leave and never come back. So the bikers backed off, terrified of scaring away the boy they had all unofficially adopted. But Dutch had seen enough. "We can't keep pretending the kid is just clumsy, Rick," Dutch said one evening, nursing a beer after Jack had walked home. "Someone is using him as a punching bag. I'm going to follow him. Just find out where he lives. See who's waiting for him behind closed doors." Rick nodded slowly, his jaw clenched tight. "Do it. Be a ghost, Dutch. Don't let him see you. If he knows we're prying, he'll run." The next afternoon, when Jack finished his shift and began his 3-mile trek across town, Dutch followed him. He didn't take his loud, rumbling chopper. He took an old beat-up Ford pickup truck that belonged to the bar. He kept 2 blocks behind the boy, watching as Jack crossed the railroad tracks and entered the affluent manicured neighborhood of Oak Creek Estates. This surprised Dutch. Oak Creek was where the doctors, lawyers, and politicians of Ridgeview lived. It didn't fit the profile of a desperately poor kid begging for minimum wage at a biker bar. Dutch parked the truck down the street and watched as Jack walked up the paved driveway of a sprawling, beautiful 2-story colonial home. The lawn was perfectly green. A tire swing hung from a massive oak tree in the front. It looked like a postcard for the American dream. Then the front door ripped open. Dutch instinctively ducked low in the cab of his truck. He watched through binoculars as a man stepped out onto the porch. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a crisp, perfectly pressed khaki uniform. A gold star gleamed on his chest. It was Sheriff Thomas Grady. Grady wasn't just a cop. He was the golden boy of Ridgeview. He was a deacon at the local church, the organizer of the annual charity drive, and a man heavily rumored to be running for state senate. He was untouchable. Dutch watched, the blood turning to ice in his veins, as the sheriff marched down the porch steps and grabbed Jack roughly by the back of his neck. Even from down the street, Dutch could see the boy go entirely rigid with fear. Grady's face was twisted in a snarl of rage as he leaned down, screaming something directly into Jack's face. Then, with a violent, jarring shove, the sheriff threw the 70-pound boy through the front door and slammed it shut behind them. Dutch sat in the truck for a long time, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Why Jack never went to the cops. Why he was so terrified to tell the truth. Who do you call for help when the monster under your bed is the man who runs the town's police force? When Dutch returned to the clubhouse and told Big Rick what he had seen, the silence in the room was deafening, the kind of silence that precedes an explosion. "Thomas Grady," Rick said softly, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "The kid is Sheriff Grady's foster son." "I saw him throw the kid like a rag doll, Rick," Dutch said, his voice trembling with a rage he was desperately trying to contain. "He's the one doing it. The highest law in the county is beating the hell out of a 12-year-old. Smitty slammed a wrench onto a metal workbench, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "We ride over there right now. We drag that badge-wearing piece of trash out into the street and show him what a real beating feels like." "No," Rick commanded, holding up a hand. The authority in his voice instantly quelled the uprising. "Think about it. We are the Hells Angels. He is the beloved town sheriff. If we ride onto his property, he'll shoot us, claim we were attacking him, and he'll be a hero. Worse, he'll have full control over Jack, and the kid will pay the price for our pride. So what do we do?" Dutch demanded. "Let him keep using the kid as a punching bag." "No," Rick said, his eyes narrowing into cold, dangerous slits. "We play the long game. We get proof. We break him." The tension escalated the very next afternoon. At exactly 4 p.m., a marked Ridgeview County Sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly into the parking lot of the Rusty Piston. The gravel crunched under its heavy tires as it parked dead center, blocking the exit. Every biker in the garage stopped what they were doing. Jack, who was currently wiping down a leather saddle, froze. All the color drained from his bruised face. He looked frantically around, as if searching for a place to hide. Sheriff Thomas Grady stepped out of the cruiser. He adjusted his gun belt, put on a pair of reflective aviator sunglasses, and strolled casually into the garage. He completely ignored the dozen massive, tattooed men staring daggers at him, and walked straight over to Jack. "There you are, son," Grady said, his voice dripping with a fake, sickeningly sweet paternal tone. "I've been worried sick. I told you not to wander off into the bad parts of town." Jack stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped. "Yes, sir." Grady reached out and clamped a heavy hand on Jack's shoulder. The boy visibly flinched. Grady looked up, a smug, arrogant smirk playing on his lips as he addressed the room. "I appreciate you boys keeping an eye on my troubled foster kid," Grady said, his tone laced with venom. "He has a habit of running away, lying, getting himself into trouble. Isn't that right, Jack?" Jack gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Big Rick stepped forward, closing the distance until he was chest to chest with the sheriff. The height difference was marginal, but Rick's sheer mass made the cop look small. "He's a good worker, Sheriff," Rick said, his voice low, a rumbling warning. "He sweeps up around here, keeps to himself. Doesn't seem like much trouble at all." Grady tilted his head, looking at Rick through his reflective lenses. "Well, you don't know him like I do, Mr. Harrison. Boys like him need strict discipline. They need a strong hand to keep them on the right path. I'd hate for him to be influenced by the wrong kind of people. Outlaws, criminals." "We just fix bikes, Sheriff," Rick replied, his eyes locked onto Grady's. "And make sure the people who work for us are taken care of." Grady's smirk vanished. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper meant only for Rick. "Listen to me, you greasy piece of trash. That boy is mine. He lives in my house, under my rules. If I ever find out he's anywhere near this hellhole again, I will bring the full force of the county down on this clubhouse. I will raid this place every night until I find a reason to put every single one of you animals in a cage. Do we understand each other?" Rick didn't blink. He just stared at the sheriff, memorizing the arrogant lines of his face. "Loud and clear, Thomas," Rick whispered back, omitting the title of sheriff on purpose. Grady sneered, grabbing Jack by the collar of his shirt. "Let's go, boy." The bikers watched in agonizing silence as the sheriff practically dragged Jack to the cruiser, shoved him into the passenger seat, and sped out of the lot, kicking up a cloud of white dust. When the dust settled, Dutch turned to Rick. "What now, boss?" Rick cracked his knuckles, a terrifying smile spreading across his scarred face. "Now we go to war." The heavy oak doors of the Rusty Piston were bolted shut. Inside, the dim neon glow illuminated the grim faces of the Ridgeview chapter. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and a palpable, violent tension. Big Rick stood by the mahogany bar. Dutch sat to his right, spinning a hunting knife on the scarred wood. "We don't ride on his house," Rick's gravelly voice broke the heavy silence. "If we kick his door in, Grady plays the victim. He'll shoot us, claims self-defense, and Jack pays the ultimate price. We need to tear his kingdom down legally. We need him in a federal cage." Smitty crossed his massive arms. "He owns the town, Rick. The judges, the deputies. How do we put a ghost behind bars?" "By finding out what the ghost is hiding," Dutch chimed in. "A man like Grady doesn't take in a battered kid out of kindness. There's an angle. We need a paper trail. We need Arthur." Arthur Higgins was a disgraced forensic accountant who had fallen hard into gambling. The club had saved him from a ruthless loan shark years ago, and Arthur owed them his life. Operating out of a dingy office 2 towns away, he was a wizard at making buried numbers speak. The next morning, Dutch and Rick dropped a thick envelope of cash on Arthur's desk. They gave him one name, Sheriff Thomas Grady. "You're asking me to poke a sleeping dragon, Rick." Arthur sweated, wiping his thick glasses. "Poke the dragon, Artie, or I'll feed you to it," Rick replied calmly. "Dig into his properties, his charities, the foster stipends. Everything." For 3 agonizing days, the bikers stayed away from Jack, watching from a distance as the boy walked home, his vibrant spark nearly extinguished. It took every ounce of Rick's discipline not to ride over and drag the boy onto his Harley. On the 4th night, Arthur's encrypted line rang the clubhouse. "You hit the mother lode." Arthur's voice crackled, trembling with fear. "Grady isn't just an abusive monster. He's a thief. I dug into his Ridgeview Youth Initiative. It's a phantom charity. He's taking maximum state funding for high-risk foster kids and laundering it through a Nevada shell company." "How much?" Dutch asked. "Hundreds of thousands," Arthur replied. "But worse, I hacked the county civil forfeiture logs. Cash seized from drug busts. The numbers Grady reports to the state are 30% lower than local dispatch records. He's skimming cartel money. That's why he isolates the kid. If Jack talks, the house of cards falls." Rick's eyes darken. "We have the motive, but federal prosecutors won't move on circumstantial math against a decorated sheriff. We need a confession." Smitty stepped forward, pulling a beautifully braided leather wristband from his pocket. Embedded deep within the heavy silver clasp was a covert micro-recording device. 48 hours of audio, Smitty explained. Voice activated. He just has to wear it. The challenge was getting it to Jack. Grady had banned the boy from the bad side of town and had deputies trailing the school bus. They needed an inside man. They needed Miss Jenkins. Sarah Jenkins, a middle school English teacher, had previously dated a prospect from the club. She knew the Angels protected their own. When Dutch intercepted her and explained the situation, showing her photos of Jack's bruises, she didn't hesitate. She had reported Grady to Child Services twice, only to watch the reports mysteriously vanish. During recess the next day, Miss Jenkins called Jack to her desk. She slipped the leather band into his trembling hand. "A large man with a beard asked me to give this to you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He said you belong to his family now. You just need to be brave one last time." Jack recognized Smitty's intricate leather work immediately. A tiny flicker of hope returned to his bruised face. He snapped it onto his wrist, hiding it beneath his flannel shirt sleeve. That evening, the storm broke. Grady had received a tip that Jack had spoken to his teacher. Paranoia gripped the corrupt cop. When Jack walked through the door of the Oak Creek Estates home, Grady was waiting in the hallway, smelling of cheap whiskey. "Who did you talk to?" Grady roared, shoving the boy against the drywall. "Nothing," Jack cried out. "You think you can play games with me?" Grady sneered, his voice echoing. "I own this town. I take the state's money for keeping you out of the gutter, and this is the respect I get? I skim $500,000 from the evidence locker just to keep this town running, and a 12-year-old piece of trash is going to ruin it." The beating that followed was brutal, but Jack didn't cry out. He simply curled into a ball, keeping his left arm tucked tight, ensuring the heavy silver clasp caught every single word, every thud, every terrifying threat. The next morning, Jack limped into Miss Jenkins' classroom. Without a word, he unclasped the wristband, placed it on her desk, and walked out. The audio file was crystal clear. When Rick, Dutch, and the rest of the club listened to it in the back room of the Rusty Piston, grown men who had survived prison riots and street wars openly wept with rage. Grady hadn't just confessed to the embezzlement and the fraud. His horrific violence toward a defenseless child was captured in agonizing detail. "Time's up," Rick said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 15 years. It was the direct line to Special Agent Carter of the FBI's Sacramento field office. They had a history, not as friends but as adversaries who respected each other's boundaries. "Carter," Rick said when the line picked up, "I'm sending you a file. It's financial records and an audio confession of Ridgeview's golden boy sheriff, Thomas Grady. Fraud, embezzlement, and extreme child abuse." There was a long pause on the other end. "Why give this to me, Harrison? You boys usually handle your own messes. Because if I handle it, I go to prison, And a kid loses his only family, Rick replied. You have 24 hours to mobilize a raid on his house. Do not contact the local authorities. Grady owns them. If you don't breach his door by tomorrow at noon, I will. Carter reviewed the file within the hour. The evidence was bulletproof. Warrants were expedited through a federal judge at midnight. But Rick wasn't about to leave anything to chance. He knew that when federal agents rolled into town, local cops often tipped off their bosses. Grady could flee, or worse, he could take Jack as a hostage. The club needed to ensure the sheriff's department was entirely incapacitated. The next morning, a Tuesday, the citizens of Ridgeview awoke to a sound that shook the dust from their rafters. It started as a low, distant rumble like an approaching earthquake. Then, it became a deafening mechanical roar. Over 200 Hells Angels members from the Ridgeview chapter, augmented by brothers called in from Oakland, San Jose, and Fresno, rode down Main Street in a massive staggered formation. They didn't break a single traffic law. They stopped at every red light. But the sheer imposing presence of 200 heavy roaring choppers brought the town to an absolute standstill. The procession snaked its way to the Ridgeview County Sheriff's Department. Slowly, methodically, the bikers parked their massive machines in an unbroken ring entirely surrounding the precinct. They blocked the exits. They blocked the patrol cars. They dismounted, crossed their leather-clad arms, and stood in absolute, terrifying silence. Inside the precinct, panic erupted. Deputies rushed to the windows, hands on their sidearms, frantically trying to call Sheriff Grady. But no one could leave. The Hells Angels weren't attacking. They were simply occupying public space, creating the most intimidating barricade in the state's history. 3 miles away, at Oak Creek Estates, Thomas Grady was completely unaware of the siege. He was angrily tossing Jack's meager belongings into a garbage bag. He had decided to send the boy to a brutal behavioral camp out of state to keep him silent. "Get your shoes on," Grady barked, turning toward the boy who sat bruised and terrified on the couch. Before Jack could move, the front door of the colonial home exploded inward with the force of a battering ram. FB, jet on the ground. "Show me your hands." A dozen heavily armed federal agents in tactical gear flooded the hallway. Grady, acting on sheer instinct, reached for his service weapon. A rifle butt caught him square in the jaw before his hand even cleared the holster, dropping the corrupt sheriff to the hardwood floor. Handcuffs clicked into place. The golden boy of Ridgeview was dragged out of his beautiful home, bleeding from the mouth, stripped of his badge, his dignity, and his power. Outside, past the federal command vehicles, a single thunderous motorcycle rumbled up to the police tape. Big Rick kicked the stand down and stepped off his bike. He ignored the furious glare of the federal agents. He walked right up to the edge of the yellow tape, his massive frame casting a long shadow on the perfectly manicured lawn. A female federal agent walked out of the house, gently leading Jack by the hand. The boy looked bewildered, his eyes wide as he took in the flashing lights and the handcuffed figure of his tormentor being shoved into the back of an SUV. Then Jack looked up and saw the giant tattooed man waiting at the perimeter. The boy broke away from the agent. He didn't run like a frightened child. He ran like a survivor who had finally found home. He ducked under the police tape and crashed into Big Rick, burying his bruised face into the biker's heavy leather vest. Rick dropped to one knee, wrapping his massive, grease-stained arms entirely around the boy. He didn't say a word. He just held him, shielding him from the chaos. A silent promise that the monsters were finally gone. The aftermath shook Ridgeview to its very core. The federal investigation dismantled the sheriff's department entirely. 5 deputies were indicted. The charity fraud was exposed on national television, and Thomas Grady was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. As for Jack, the system tried to place him in another foster home. But Big Rick and his wife, a tough-as-nails emergency room nurse named Martha, fought a grueling 18-month legal battle. Backed by high-priced lawyers funded by the collective pool of the Hells Angels, they won. Years later, if you walked into the Rusty Piston on a Saturday afternoon, you wouldn't see a terrified kid sweeping floors for pocket change. You'd see a healthy, confident young man with a mechanic's rag over his shoulder, rebuilding classic engines alongside Dutch and Smitty. No one expects salvation to arrive on two wheels. But in a dusty town where the law was the criminal, it took an army of outlaws to teach a broken boy what family truly meant. Some heroes wear badges, but the real ones wear leather and grease. Jack's journey from a terrified victim to a protected son proves that family isn't about blood. It's about who stands between you and the monsters. If this story of brutal justice and unbreakable loyalty gave you chills, hit that like button. Share it with your friends and subscribe for more unbelievable real-life stories.